So I think foreign governments, the US especially, should look less at the value of the yuan and more at market access problems that their companies are having. On the social stability front, the village of Wukan has been in the headlines, village in Guangdong, where there's been protests for the last few months, and in recent days, some fairly violent protests. I think this reflects ultimately the lack of a rule of law in China and the power of local officials. It manifests itself in different ways. Different issues are the spark of these protests in different places. In the case of Wukan, it was the land grabs, the local officials taking the land from the farmers and selling it to developers for a profit. But in other locations, it's different issues. So I don't think this particular protest, although it's bigger in size than some we've seen recently, it's not qualitatively different. But there's clearly something very interesting going on in Chinese society. You know, we see surveys from reputable Beijing universities showing that 40% of the people in the country are unhappy, or 70% of the farmers in particular are unhappy. There's what the People's Daily has called a crisis of faith in the Chinese government. And what I think is new about that is that Chinese people have always been skeptical of their local governments, but they've tended to maintain their faith in Beijing and the central government. They think that the leaders in Beijing are doing a good job. The abuses are due to the leaders at the local level, and if they could just get through to the leaders in Beijing, they would fix these problems. And I think that's starting to break down as people realize that the policies now are designed to aid the large state-owned companies, the politically well-connected, and that there's less social mobility than there used to be in, say, the 1980s and 1990s. So that's creating a lot of frustration. And you know, combine that with rising expectations and a tough economic climate, and I think you possibly have some possibility for some explosive situations in the next year. I think maybe I'll stop there, and then maybe we were talking also about Southeast Asia, geopolitical kinds of stuff, but we'll see if we have time for that maybe. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugo, for a very, I would say, we opened it with, wow, look at China, and here we have Hugo putting things into perspective. Well, it's not so easy to do business in China. It's not as rosy as you would have read in the papers. And indeed, this is what our next speaker, Jude, who is based in Beijing from Atlas Foundation, will be talking more about as he discusses on communist China, politics, and human rights issues. Without further ado, sir, please.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back here in Malaysia. There might be a slight amount of overlap with what Hugo just said, especially on the social stability, so just please bear with me. What I wanted to talk about today was largely, I guess, the issue of how do we talk about China? China is so much in the news, you can't open an editorial page without seeing a big Think China piece. And as someone who's lived in China for going on 6 years now, I did some university there, I've worked at KPMG, now the Atlas Economic Research Foundation, I get increasingly frustrated with the way we talk about China. And this is a left thing, this is a right thing, this is a center, this is a socialist, you name it, I find this problem. And it's not to say that it's because they don't agree with me on China. It's just that I think our narrative of China has started to overtake the reality of China. When I was asked to give this talk, they said, you know, could you talk about capitalism in communist China? And I could, but I could also talk about communism in capitalist China. And if China is capitalist or communist, my answer to that depends on what day of the week it is, because I think one can make a plausible case either way. Arguing the case that China is not communist is quite easy. I originally went to China 10 years ago as a student, and this month it was the month China joined the WTO. And the transformation, even in that 10 years between then and now, is remarkable. Let alone talk to people who went to China in 1978, 1979, just after Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening. It's remarkable. It's a different country. We've had 30 years of roughly 10% economic growth. And just think not only physically, what does that do to a country, but what does that do to a country's culture? That growth, that creative destruction. I think that's hard to measure. You've got 44 Chinese companies on the Fortune 500. I'm going to return to that in a minute when I argue why it's also not capitalist. I live in a neighborhood called Guomao, which is the CBD of Beijing. And although I have a very humble little apartment, when you look out the window, you see five-star hotels like the Park Hyatt, you see Dolce & Gabbana, you see Rolls-Royce. I have a BMW dealership just underneath me. McDonald's, obviously, Starbucks. Superficially, it's not a communist country. It's one of the first reactions people have when they first land in Shanghai or Beijing, and they go down Huaihai Lu in Shanghai or Chang'anjie in Beijing. Is this is not what I thought it was like. I thought I was visiting a communist country. I'm going to skip a bunch, but. You know, I saw about a month ago the Mukhtar Kent, the CEO of Coca-Cola, made a big fuss, and it was in the Financial Times and all over, where he said, it's easier to do business in China than it is in the West. So just as summing up, I think it's quite clear we're not talking about Mao's China. But does that mean we're talking about Adam Smith's notion of a capitalist country? And there, I think it's harder to say. I want to return to Mukhtar Kent's comments because they're typical, and I also find them frustrating. The CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, of course, is going to find it easy to do business in China. It's an authoritarian dictatorship where he says to the local government, jump, and they say, how high? But that's not what capitalism is, or at least it's not to me. What we need to look at is, what does the average entrepreneur, what does the SME face when they try and do business in China? And there, the experience of Coca-Cola, of Walmart, and McDonald's, of Starbucks doesn't mean anything. There we have a much different situation. And there we can't talk about China and the Chinese economy without talking about the Communist Party, which is not an issue you deal with in capitalist countries. Even non-democratic countries like Singapore, like the former Hong Kong, you did not have an entity like the party which had its, sorry for the illusion, but its tentacles in every aspect of economic life. And here's where it's easy to say, again, one of the things that frustrated, we live in a post-Mao China, as if it was sort of Mao Zedong died and then we've got this new capitalist paradise. And the reality is far from that. I'll get to human rights in a minute, but even on the economic front, we had a decade of liberalization in the 1980s under Deng Xiaoping. And this is, I highly recommend people read a book called Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics by Huang Yasheng, who's at MIT. It's in English, where he charts the nonlinear progression or regression sometimes of China's economic reforms. The 1980s was a fairly freewheeling liberal period where you saw what the state essentially did was it took its boot off the neck of the entrepreneurs. And guess what happens when you do that? You had entrepreneurial energy bottled up over the entirety of China's communist period. They allow them for the first time, not legally, mind you, not institutionally, which is an important point, but they signal that you will no longer be sent to jail if you start a business. Which, mind you, in 1984, there was a case made it to Deng Xiaoping's desk, then the supreme leader, of a guy who ran a company called Idiot Seeds. And his crime, and what Deng Xiaoping was deciding, again, the highest leader in China was, this guy has 100 employees, do we throw him in jail? Not that he'd committed any crime. His crime was he had 100 employees. And on the books then, 1984, it was illegal to have a private firm with more than 4 employees, right? Institutionally, that didn't change till the late 80s when finally you were allowed to have a private firm. But the 80s was a fairly liberal time in China. The 90s, a mixed bag. You had the rise of what was called the Shanghai model, which was we began to see the gelling of the party and business. This past decade has been a different story in a bad way. You were talking about the 2008 recession, global recession around the world. China took a different tack than a lot of countries. China, given it doesn't have to deal with messy democratic procedures, instituted a $500-ish billion stimulus package, primarily through, as Hugo was saying, through the banks, opening the spigots. Loan, loan, loan. Who did they loan to? There's a phrase in Chinese, which I don't know, maybe you've heard, which has come out in intellectual circles the past 4 or 5 years, called 国进民退. 国 means 国家, means the country, right? Jin means to advance. Min means the people or the private sector. Tui means to step back. Loosely translated, it means the state is advancing while the private sector retreats. As these billions of dollars of loans were going out, were flooding out all over China after 2008, where were they going? They were going to SOEs, right? They were going to SOEs. The heads of the SOEs, the heads of the banks, most of them have a nice little red phone on their desk. That is a phone which links them all up with the party, we can say. They were getting calls saying, you're going to be getting money from China Construction Bank, from again, the big 4 state-owned banks. Spend it somehow. We don't know, just spend it. This has been a very, very worrying trend in China, and it worries many liberal intellectuals who I know and work with, liberal economists, because the gains that have been made in beating back the state, in the rule of law, in competition, we've started to see a retreat in those as these big strategic SOEs are advancing. And again, when we talk about SOEs, there was a privatization process in the 1990s in China. And I can't say it was trivial, but what China did is it did something in Chinese where they said they grasped the large, they released the small. By that they meant the strategically important SOEs, telecommunications, energy, shipping. They kept all these ones, and they got rid of the other ones. They nominally and in real terms privatized the other ones. So returning back to that Fortune 500 list, of those companies, of the, what I say, 44, about 40 of them are the SOEs. You've got Sinopec is in the top 10, right? The petroleum company in China, the SOE, is in the top 10 of Fortune 500. The State Grid is number 8 in the Fortune 500. China National Petroleum Corporation is 10th. These are big boys. These are powerful entities. And these are increasingly deciding and having an influence in economic policy. So, sorry, I'm going long, but if we want to talk about as China capitalists, we need to look at how does it treat its small capitalists, its small entrepreneurs, its SMEs, and there it is a mixed bag. You had a recent crisis in Wenzhou, China, where you had a few dozen owners of SMEs fleeing, running away from their debts. In itself, I don't think necessarily means much, but that created a larger discussion in Chinese academic circles and intellectual circles on we're not paying any attention to the SMEs, excuse me. Wen Jiabao made a trip down to Wenzhou to sort of soothe the SMEs down there. Wenzhou is sort of typical or is the archetype of the private sector in China. If any of you smoke, you don't have to admit it, but if any of you smoke and you have a lighter, chances are it was made in Wenzhou. Wenzhou and the SMEs in China account for about 80% of all employment. But they're treated like dirt in China politically. They're treated like nothing. They don't get access to bank credit. That goes to the SOEs. Property rights, there's no institutional protection really. Just depends on the arbitrariness of the local government. I was going to go on longer than that, but I want to, just for time, I want to shift directions here. And I wanted to talk about some of the things that worry me about China. We often hear it's sort of onward and upward to the heavens for China, and it's 10% growth from here on out. You hear about China overcoming the United States in a matter of 10, 15 years. And it may. I don't know. It may. It doesn't bother me. But I want you to know that right now, There's individuals languishing in jails, black jails we call them, which are extra legal, as a nice phrase, meaning they're illegal. They're not in the books. These are people who speak out for rule of law, transparency, economic freedom. I think you probably know about the story of the blind lawyer. You probably know, thanks to Christian Bale, who 2 days ago tried to go visit Chengguangcheng and was beaten back by the local thugs who have kept this blind human rights lawyer confined to his house without medical care. Gao Zhisheng, who is another liberal lawyer, nobody knows where he is. Again, this is a lawyer. They have the gall to put lawyers in jail without charges and just make them disappear. I saw a report last week by the Committee to Support Chinese Lawyers. They say that in 2011, remember, the Chinese government was very skittish about the Jasmine protests, about Egypt, about Libya. 24 individuals were disappeared. And disappeared means, I can't believe this happens in the 21st century in China, but a van pulls up behind you, they put a cloak over your head, and they take you to some unmarked room in some tacky hotel on the outside of Beijing, and they torture you. A friend of mine who was stupid enough to be writing tweets about the Jasmine Revolution was disappeared for a month earlier this year. The authorities tracked down what's called Weibo in Chinese, which is the Twitter account they use, tracked down the Twitter account to a specific apartment complex, came in as he was sitting in his underwear tweeting, and took him away for a month. And when he was there, he was in solitary confinement in a cheap hotel room, without access to any outsiders, never allowed to speak, had the lights on 24 hours a day, and then he was just suddenly released. That is barbaric to me. And yes, I know things happen in the United States and they're disgusting and we should speak out about them. But in the United States, you can speak out about them. You don't have that luxury in China. We've got people like Liu Xiaobo, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, who's rotting in some jail right now in the north of Beijing. We talked about the riot in Wuhan right now. It's not a protest, it's a riot. You have thousands of villagers who have essentially blockaded their town from the government. They're keeping themselves safe from the government because the government has stolen their land and sold it to crooked developers and has offered the farmers either nothing for their land or far below market wage. So you've had an armed revolt in southern China, right? The government has cut off all supply lanes. So right now they think they have enough food for about 8 days. But they're smuggling food in the back of motorcycles from the nearby village. It's a riot. It's an open revolt. And these happen 200,000, not of this magnitude, but these mass disturbances happen upwards of 2,000 times a year. I don't want to be incendiary, and I hope no one here minds, but Tiananmen Square, the cause of Tiananmen Square was far less than this. Was far less than this. And now you add technologies like Weibo, the Twitter, you add the internet. I don't want to make the internet seem like it's a panacea, which always means liberty as soon as you introduce it, because the state is very effective at utilizing the internet. But I do want to say that these technologies, this ability to connect, the ability that now, until it's blocked, people who are on Weibo, people who have blogs, cell phones, sending pictures, have the ability to know about a Wuhan uprising, whereas 10, 15 years ago they wouldn't, says something. I don't think I agree Wuhan is the spark, and I don't know if there's going to be a spark. And to some extent, I hope there's not a spark. But I think there's some significant issues China needs to deal with. And if I can try and bring it around to my original point, which I think I strayed far away from, we need to think carefully about the narrative of China. And what I want us to do is to begin to look at China as a normal country. Yes, it is the second largest economy in the world. That's one statistic. Here's another statistic. In terms of per capita GDP, it ranks with about Jamaica. Nobody's talking about the Jamaica miracle, nor should they be. I like Jamaica, though. Let's begin to talk about China as a normal country. And I think when we do that, we'll be able to have a more sane conversation about China's future, about our future, and about the future of the world.